Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are, whatever time it is. I hope that this presentation, this Screencastify finds you well. I hope that you're having a wonderful day. I thought that instead of just doing a random Screencastify from the dozens and dozens that I've done over the course of this instructional year, and there are dozens and dozens, given the current state of our working conditions, I thought I would do one that works in tandem with the media rich presentation that I put together for this final project. And so this presentation was called Social Order, Looking to the Past to Inform Future Decisions. And it's a presentation that I've used in my own classroom on numerous occasions over the years. It's one that I've used for other courses that's been very well reviewed. And so I've tried to kind of augment and modify it for the sake of kind of fitting within the confines of a digital learning space. I'm sure that it's not entirely perfect for that just yet. But the essential question that drives this presentation and that kind of drives the student discussion here is this idea of how is social order created? And should laws carry harsher punishments than more lenient ones? And this is a discussion that I get into with my students um, on numerous occasions throughout the year, especially as we enter the Fertile Crescent and start to get into ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia and kind of the cradle of civilization, where our sense of law and order kind of found itself being born at the kind of basis of human civilization. And so I feel like it would be important to preface here that if you're looking for the pertinent copyright material, you will find them in the individual slides, which I've also included in my um, final project. You'll be able to look in the margins and find the image sources as well as the pertinent copyright information to the source material, which is our district adopted history textbook, the e-book version of it, which is run through Pearson. So you'll be able to find all that when you take a look at the slides themselves. There's also a works cited page at the very end in case you were curious. So normally in a presentation such as this, I would spend this a few minutes going over what materials the kids were going to need, right? And in this case, they would need whiteboards and markers, and they would need their pencil. They would need a piece of poster paper, which I would have provided for them, colored pencils, Google Docs, and Google Classroom as well. I always think it's important to start with the important materials and precisely what it is that they're going to need, right? And I always end this portion by reminding them the most important material that they could have right now is that they need to have their brains on, right? And so for this kind of social distancing, remote learning, teaching from home thing, I always, in the videos that I produce on a daily basis, I remind my kids that if now is not a good time, if you're not firing on all cylinders, take a pause break, go get yourself a glass of water. Go caffeinate if necessary. Go get yourself something to eat. Find a nice, quiet workplace, workspace, well lit. Find somewhere where the shades aren't drawn and the lights aren't off. You're not next door to sister who's trying to take a nap. Or your younger brother who's in the middle of his kindergarten lesson. Go try to find a quiet, well lit place to work and turn on that brain and get those neural synapses firing as much as you can. Now, I always, at the beginning of a lesson such as this, I always go over my expectations. And this is something that my students are well aware of. They can recite these in their sleep, and I have them read these to me kind of at the beginning of each lesson. My expectations are that they listen and follow directions, right? So if I'm asking them to take a minute to think, pair, share, or to take a moment to check for understanding, to kind of jot down some thoughts, to bounce an idea off a neighbor, or to write something down formally in their notes. This is something that I require and expect at the very least. Um, I also expect them to be actively participating, right? And so if I am asking for their input, I'll oftentimes kind of wait until I get it. And that's been a very difficult, bitter pill for many of my students to swallow as they've kind of learned to kind of hide and languish in anonymity over the internet over these past few months. Another expectation is that cameras are on. And while I can't mandate this per our district agreements and requirements, I can certainly highly encourage it and suggest it. And one of the things I always kind of beg them is to practice effective and efficient collaborations, right? No sidebar conversations. And if a student is unable to make it to a synchronous Zoom session, it is expected that that sidebar conversation uh, applies also to sidebar activities such as the cell phone, such as the television, such as having extra tabs open on the Chromebook, right? Engaging in activities with cousins who are visiting or friends who are over, right? And so I kind of expect um, students to practice these effective and efficient collaborations. And we do have time for sidebar conversations and auxiliary kind of activities when the time calls for it. And at all times, I tie these to our PBIS expectations, which are SOAR, which my students are well aware of, but you may not be, stands for show respect, on task, act responsibly, and reach for personal best at all times. And you'll notice our eagle is here kind of staring sternly at the students to kind of reinforce that these are basic expectations and not loose suggestions. So I always like to launch into a basic review of what we've covered and activate that prior knowledge. And one of the things that my students would have had at this point in the unit is a rudimentary understanding of the history of early laws in ancient Sumer, in ancient other parts of ancient Mesopotamia, and that these written laws were collected in cities into codes and kind of assembled into sets and into larger collections that we kind of refer to as codes, right? And the earliest of these was known as the Code of Ur-Nammu. And this was kind of put into place by the king of Ur. And the Code of Ur-Nammu included laws about things like marriage and slavery and causing harm to others. And this is something that I like to tie into modern discussion because our students are often under the misconception that modern laws and that history is kind of just a collection of dead guys that did some things, right? And so I try to tie it into modern times, and I try to remind them that our modern um, codes of laws, they still concern themselves with issues of marriage and slavery and fair working conditions and wages and what happens when we cause harm to others. And one of these laws that I like to point out to them reads that if a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out half a mina of silver. Mina, again, is something that they would have known by now, refers to a unit of weight that varied kind of over time, but was close, an approximation of a pound. And so this is where I would stop to kind of check for understanding, and I would kind of get kind of read the temperature of the room. What are their thoughts on attaching monetary value to bodily injury? Is there a way to effectively and efficiently kind of quantify human suffering and pain with monetary value? And this would be a point in the discussion where my students and I would kind of kick this idea around and hopefully lead to a deeper understanding of the fact that it may not be a perfect solution, but that it is in many ways more perfect than the eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth model. And this is where we would kind of launch into the other contracts that we would have studied in Mesopotamia, right? And this is again where I would stop and I would ask my students to kind of kick around and debate the idea of social contracts. How do they help to develop and create and maintain social order? Can they think of any contracts that they have signed? And for instance, one that they would be painfully aware of is our class constitution, which is a living document that they help to create, that they help to kind of assemble the laws, the rules, restrictions of power. What is it that we are allowed to do in class or should be allowed to do in class? What is it that the teacher should not be allowed to do to students? And so this is something that they would be very well acquainted with, in no small part because they would have partaken in the creation and kind of implementation of a social contract by this point in the year. Another thing that we get into is the idea of Hammurabi's code, right? And this is one of the things that we're going to be just kind of exploring in the actual project aspect of this presentation. And they would have known that Hammurabi's Code is a collection of almost 300 rules and laws, and that they established the standards for commercial interactions and they set fines for punishments to meet the requirements of justice. And not only that, they would be well aware of the fact that Hammurabi's Code and many of these other codes of law in the area around this time would have been not only displayed in public on stone pillars such as these, um, but that they would be read to the public on a regular basis. And we would kind of kick around this idea of why that might be important. Why is it essential that the general public be made aware of rules and laws, and the punishments and kind of penalties that they carry? And this year, I was really pleased to see that my students were kind of aware of the fact that the United States law is somewhat convoluted in some aspects, and that some laws contradict themselves in certain areas, and that they're not always easy to understand and not always made plainly available. And so this would be a place where they would stop and think and pair share, where they would talk about specific examples of laws from Hammurabi's code that they would have learned about. Do they have any thoughts on these laws? Are the punishments fair? Are the punishments too harsh, and why? And so not only does this um, kind of engage their group learning, but it also gives me a good assessment of who's been internalizing the information throughout the unit. Who is it that's kind of internalizing the key aspects of Hammurabi's code? And from here, this is where we would kind of debate what is social order. And we would do this in class by way of a circle map. Where we would kind of jot down ideas. And generally speaking, they are able to kind of recapitulate their understanding of social order, or the idea that it entails and encompasses organization and laws and rules and contracts, things like peace and harmony and growth and stability, right? It's not just enough to stand still as a culture. It is kind of paramount to the success and continued stability to grow in a way that is sustainable and balanced, right? And then we would get into this discussion of what social order does not encompass, or what it may not be. And in this way, social order is not disorganization. It is not lawlessness. It is not chaos and war and turmoil and instability and imbalance and all of these things that we are confronted with every time we open our phones. And this would also be an opportunity for me to kind of ask them if they were aware of any recent events. And I'm sure that as of uh, late July 2021, or January rather of 2021, each and every one of my students could bring up things like the Capitol insurrection, or the riots earlier last year when we first went on lockdown and quarantine. And we would kind of debate, what is it that leads to social unrest and lawlessness and chaos? And is it sometimes appropriate to I don't, for lack of a better term, rage against the machine? Is it sometimes symptomatic of some deeper uh, and more fundamental flaw in our social makeup when we are confronted with disorganization and lawlessness? Are there things that need to be um, revised and rewritten and reconsidered? And without fail, every year that we have this discussion, I'm always happy to see that several of my students decide to jump up and start to talk about slavery. And some will even kind of showcase their knowledge of the Jim Crow laws in the South, and how certain things, certain aspects of society often do lead to disorganization and lawlessness when they become so overgrown and impossible to confront peacefully or civilly. And so these are really great debates that I have with my kids. And it's one of the things that kind of leads me to this common ground idea here. I want them to consider the proposition, and to also consider how strongly they disagree or agree with it. Stealing is wrong and should carry a severe punishment. Before they decide, I always have them consider, how would they feel if somebody stole their phone from their backpack, right? And what I would do then is I would split my kids into groups, and there would be color coded corners in my classroom. Red corner would be strongly agree, orange corner would be mostly agree, yellow corner would be disagree, and green corner would be strongly agreed. And the way that I've done this year, and unfortunately I'm not allowed to record my Zoom sessions with my kids, which is why I'm giving you kind of a play by play of how it would work, is that I broke them into breakout rooms: red group, orange group, yellow group, and green group. And I allowed them to join the group that they felt that they were in most agreement with. And I have found varying kind of degrees of different kind of permutations of student body kind of activity and behavior with this. Some kids really agree, right, that they If somebody stole their iPhone, they would want that person punished severely, harshly, sometimes gratuitously, and unusually and cruelly, right? And then what we would do is after that, I would say, okay, I want you to table your current state of mind, and I would like for you to consider this. What Kohlberg often referred to as the Heinz dilemma. And the Heinz dilemma is that age old kind of thought experiment that we're all fairly or should be fairly familiar with that involves a woman who's on her deathbed. And there's one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that the druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to produce. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, whose name was Heinz, went to everybody that he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay in installments later over time. But the druggist said, no, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it. So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's laboratory to steal a drug for his wife. So my question to the class is, should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? And this is where I would kind of let them break off again and kind of reconsider the original proposition that stealing is wrong and should be punished harshly. Should theft of something as arbitrary and punitive as an iPhone be treated the same as stealing life-saving medication for your dying wife? And this is where I would release them into their collaborative groups to embark upon the actual project-based aspect of this lesson. What their groups are charged with is rewriting their own version of the original proposition that stealing is wrong and should be punished harshly, and to include their own opinions, their thoughts, improvements, maybe some accommodations, and some different variations in penalties depending on what was stolen and for what reasons. What they were tasked with doing is to write their own version of the law on the piece of poster paper with specific examples for punishments. And what we would end up doing is turning these laws into kind of stone tablets that then resembled Hammurabi's original code, and we would display them throughout the class. So the guiding question, again, is should all people of all ages, and I would even at this point include of all classes and social backgrounds, be punished the same for the crime of theft? How should we differentiate when we punish different groups of people? Groups or members must vote and reach unanimity, or at least a majority, before they approve and set their laws in stone. Because once they are in stone, I remind them, in stone means unchangeable. So the example that I gave them is that thou shalt not kill unless one's own life is in danger and there is no other way to defend oneself. And some of the accommodation, or some of the uh, different thoughts that I had included in this example is, okay, well, if a man kills another man on purpose, he should be put to death. Well, what if a man kills another man on accident? Then should he serve the same time in prison as and maybe take on the financial responsibility of the deceased man's family? If a person under the age of 18 kills another person, then should he be given the opportunity to serve a reasonable amount of time in prison before having a second chance at freedom? And these are the kinds of different accommodations that I kind of model for them to kind of show them how to start the conversation, to take an original proposition such as thou shalt not kill unless one's own life is in danger and there's no other way by which to defend oneself, and kind of explore the different avenues of it. And my students at this point would be charged with creating their stone tablets. And at the end, there is an independent reflection that I would ask them to kind of embark upon, to open a Google Doc that I would have given and kind of formatted for them and write at least a couple paragraphs about how they revised and rewrote each law. What was the process? What was the conversation like? Have their opinions on crime and punishment changed at all after rewriting the law or considering different scenarios? They will be graded on how well they use their RACES strategy. And RACES is an acronym that stands for restate and answer the prompt, cite text evidence, explain and elaborate, and summarize. And so they are that's part of the rubric by which they would be graded, and how clearly they articulate and communicate their thoughts, opinions, or attitudes. Okay, so the guiding question again is the importance of laws carrying penalties. And again, the works cited page is right here. And so, under normal circumstances, like I said, I would have student examples for you. But again, because of my district's kind of lock and key attitude towards sharing student information right now, I'm going to go ahead and hold off on that. But I hope that this screencast kind of demonstrates my ability to get through a media rich presentation. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.